She hung up on the kidnappers, mid-sentence. One motion, calm and final, her finger on the red icon while the man on the other end was still talking. 4 armed men in the room went rigid. At the father's shoulder, an old man who had whispered, pay them now all night, drew a breath to object. And Namgungyul, the man no one in this city had ever said no to, whose 6-year-old daughter had been stolen out of a locked courtyard in broad daylight, turned to look at her like she had just made the last mistake of her life. Imara Diallo did not flinch. She took his wrist instead, 2 fingers flat against the pulse, hammering under the skin, the way she'd been taught a lifetime ago, to ground a man before he does the thing he can never take back. Breathe, she said, low enough that only he could hear it. And for one strange second, in a room built entirely of fear, the only warm thing in it was 2 of her fingers on the inside of his wrist. They've had your daughter since yesterday afternoon. It's the dead of night now, and they still haven't named a price, she said. People who take a child for money open with a number. These people opened with a grave. He stared at her. He did not understand yet why that was the worst thing she could have told him. It isn't a ransom. It's a debt, and nobody on earth outbids a debt. So the worst thing you can do right now is sound like a man who drained the river to get her back. His pulse, under her fingers, dropped a single beat. Before we call them back, you're going to tell me who you put in the ground and whose family you broke doing it. Because whoever took your daughter already knows, and I can't win a game where I'm the only one at the table who hasn't read the board. Quick thing before we go further. If you're new here, welcome in, and you need to subscribe right now. Because what unfolds before daylight is the kind of story that stays with you long after it's over. Tap that like button, drop a comment, and tell me what you think this man buried. But to understand how Imara Diallo ended up in that room, we have to go back to the moment a stranger knocked on her door and she turned him away. He'd come to her door at 2 a.m. A man in a suit that cost more than her rent, soaked through and unhurried about it, and he'd introduced himself as Pio Guillaume and asked for 90 seconds of her time. She gave him 60. He used them to tell her a child had been taken and that she was the only person in the city who could bring the girl back. She told him she didn't do this anymore. She hadn't done it in 3 years. She had been good at it once, very good. A woman who could hear a kidnapper's whole soul in the way he said a number. And then a night had come that she did not talk about. She told Pio Guillaume no a second time and started to close the door. She didn't do it anymore because of a boy named Khalil, 8 years old, a standoff that should have ended quietly, a call made over her head by a man with more rank and less sense, and a small body that came home in a way no child's ever should. After Khalil, she had stopped trusting that being right was enough to keep anyone alive, because she had been right that night, and it hadn't been. She'd left the work, left the country, ended up in Seoul teaching crisis communication to executives who would never have to use it, because it was as far from her own name as a person could get, and because nobody in that classroom would ever bleed for her mistakes. She carried a photograph of Khalil folded in her wallet, so she was already closing the door when Pio held up his phone. On the screen was a 6-year-old girl, asleep, with a stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, the last picture her father had of her. From the night before, she was lifted out of a private courtyard in broad daylight while 3 rings of security looked the other way. Her name was Bomb, Pio said. It meant spring. Imara looked at that sleeping child for a long time, at the small fist closed around the rabbit's ear, and she felt the careful, quiet life she'd built crack straight down the middle, because she knew exactly what it cost to fail a child you'd been asked to save, and she had sworn never to feel that particular weight again. Then she got her coat. Namgung. The surname alone had told her something before the gate even opened, because it is an old name and a rare 1-2 syllables where almost everyone else has one. Shipping, steel, a dozen things that gleamed in daylight, and underneath them, a quieter enterprise that made a man powerful enough to earn an enemy, patient enough to take his child. She found him in a war room beneath the compound. A wall of dark screens and a city map, and 4 men who all stopped breathing when she walked in, because not one of them could imagine why their boss had sent for an outsider in a teaching coat on the worst night of his life. He was younger than the legend and harder than she'd braced for, and under the granite he was a father coming apart at a speed only she could see. He'd already drained an account he was sure they'd demand. He had cars idling to take the city apart by hand. "They tell me you were the best in the world," he said. "I was something, once. And now? Now I'm the only person in this building who isn't too frightened of you to tell you you're wrong. Tonight that's the whole job." She set her wallet on the table. "Here's how it works. I run this. Not your men, not your money, me. You don't place a call, send a car, move a coin, or so much as breathe toward these people without me. Every instinct you have right now is a father's instinct, and a father's instincts are precisely the wrong ones. Trust them, and you bury your daughter." Namgung Yul, who had not been spoken to that way in 20 years, looked at her for a long, dangerous moment, and then something behind his eyes quietly gave way, not to fear of her, but to the first relief he'd felt all night. He sat down. "Tell me what to do," he said. And the way he said it, the surrender in it, did something to her that she filed away there was a child somewhere in the dark, and this was not the hour for it. He was not the only one in that room who mattered, though it took her a while to understand it. There was an old man at his side, and Yule deferred to him the way you only defer to family. He had to be 70, with the still hands of a man who had stopped needing to prove anything decades ago, and the father introduced him as Mok Sang Cheol, and then, because the word mattered more than the name, said, "He raised me. Before any of this, before I was anyone, there was him." The old man poured the father's coffee himself all night, the way a parent does, and he was the only person in the building who touched the boss without flinching. And from the first hour he gave counsel, gently, mournfully, like a man whose own heart was breaking alongside the father's. "Pay them," he said. "Whatever they ask, the moment they ask it. What is money against the child?" And when Imara held the line and made the father wait, the old man would lay a hand on his arm and say, not unkindly, that he was sure the woman knew her trade, but that no theory on earth was worth a grandchild, and surely it could not hurt to have men ready and a bag packed, just in case, so they lost not 1 second when the moment came. Every word of it was wrong. Every word of it was also exactly what a frightened, devoted old man would say. And that was the thing, there was no seam in it. Even Imara, who watched everyone with the same flat suspicion, came away thinking only that he loved the boy too much to be any use, and feeling a little sorry for him for it. She did not think anything worse. None of them did. That was the whole of his genius, though no one in that room had the word for it yet. The most dangerous voice in the house was indistinguishable from the most loving one. She got the truth out of the father in a gap when the old man stepped out for the coffee he was forever pressing on everyone. The father told it the way men like him surrender anything, in pieces, with long silences in the seams. 25 years ago he had been nobody, a boy with a borrowed name and empty pockets that an old chairman had taken in. And the chairman had a rule for the men he raised. Before he would trust you, he made you do one thing you could never undo. So your loyalty stopped being a choice and became a chain. The thing he handed young Yule was a person. A young man named Tail, who had crossed the organization, who knew too much, who had to be erased so completely that not even a body would surface to ask a question. I took him down to the old pier at Mapo, below the bend in the river, on a winter night, the father said, and I made him. And here the smallest thing happened, a hitch, a flinch at the back of the word, his jaw setting against something. I made him disappear. Imara had spent her whole life listening to the place where a sentence almost says one thing and chooses another, and this one rang like a struck glass. She didn't reach for it. The clock was running. She filed it. "Whose family did you break doing it?" she asked, because the phone had said a debt, and debts have survivors. The father glanced at the door the old man had gone through, then back at her, and said the unbearable thing very quietly. His older brother is the man pouring my coffee in the next room. Mock, the one who raised me. He let it sit. I was ordered to put his little brother in that river, and instead of a body, the family was handed a story that the boy had taken money and run and would never be back. Mock has grieved that betrayal at my own table every morning for 25 years. He believes his brother abandoned him. He has never once known there was a death in any of it. And that, the father said, was the one mercy left in the whole of it, and the only reason he could swear on his daughter's life that the man who had taken her was not Mock, because as far as Mock had ever known, there was nothing in the world to avenge. So whoever found that grave and opened it, he said, it is someone else, an enemy. I have been awake all night trying to think who could even know it was there. As if the word had summoned him, the door opened and the old man came back in with 2 coffees and a soft, sorrowful murmur about the cars he kept insisting on. And the father went quiet mid-breath, and Imara watched him go quiet, and a cold thing turned over in her that she could not yet name. It turned again an hour later. A screen on the father's desk woke with a column of figures on it, a payment that had gone out every single month for more years than made any sense, to an account with no name attached, and the father darkened it almost before it finished loading. And in the half-second before he did, his eyes cut sideways to the old man, fast, to see whether he had seen. Imara caught the glance and read it the way the whole room would have read it. The boss, checking himself in front of the one man he answered to, the reflex of a lifetime of trust. She filed the account as a bribe, a buried debt, the kind of thing men like this all keep, and she filed the glance as nothing at all. It would be hours before she understood she had watched the same thing twice and named it wrong both times, that there had been no trust in that look, only dread. The dread of a man whose worst secret had just lit up a screen with the one person alive who must never see it sitting close enough to read it. What she did for the next several hours was slow time down. She would not let him answer the demand, would not let him plead, would not let him give the man on the line 1 ounce of how much it was costing. She owned the rhythm of the calls, the silences, the breath between them. And she listened to the kidnappers the way other people listen to music. Not to the words were theater, but to the cadence, the breathing. The younger voice that once corrected the older and got slapped down for it. She listened past them, to the room behind the room. A train, twice, on the same line. A loudspeaker too muffled to read but rhythmic, repeating. The dead drone of an announcement still looping somewhere on a forgotten dock. The damp echo of concrete and a high ceiling near water. She built a map of a place she'd never seen out of nothing but sound, and Yule watched her do it. And somewhere in those hours the way he looked at her changed. And somewhere in the dead middle of the night, when the calls went quiet and the old man had stepped out again and it was only the 2 of them and the hum of the screens, the father asked her something that had nothing to do with his daughter. You keep reaching for your wallet, he said. You never open it. What's in it? She could have deflected. She had deflected that question from better trained people. Instead, because it was 3 a.m, and because he had handed her the truth about the worst thing he'd ever done and trusted her to carry it, she took the photograph out and set it on the table between them, face up, and told him about Khalil in her own words, which she had not done out loud in 3 years. The 8-year-old, the standoff she'd had read correctly down to the minute. The man above her who'd decided he knew better with 4 seconds left on a clock she'd begged him not to start. I was right, she said, and her voice did not shake, which was somehow worse. I want you to understand that, because everyone tries to comfort me by telling me I couldn't have known. I knew. Being right just isn't the same as being listened to, and a child died in the gap between those 2 things. I left because I couldn't stand in another one of these rooms and be right and unheard while it happened again. Yule looked at the photograph for a long moment, And he didn't reach for the easy words, didn't tell her it wasn't her fault, didn't tell her she'd save this one. He reached across the table instead and turned the photo a careful few degrees toward himself so he could see the boy's face properly. The way you handle a thing that's precious to someone. And he looked at Khalil like he mattered, and then he looked back at her. Then tonight, he said, I will listen, even when it costs me. Especially then. It was not much. It was the most anyone had given her in 3 years. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the space between her hand and his on the table was about 4 inches of cheap laminate and 25 years of two people deciding never to need anyone, and neither of them closed it. She put Khalil away, and her hands were steady when she did it, and she did not look at how steady his had gone too. The tell came on the third call. The man on the phone named a place for the first exchange, a particular stretch of bank under a particular bridge, and dismissed 2 alternatives before the father's people had even thought to raise them, and the hair stood up on the back of Imara's neck. Because the man knew which sites this family judged safe and which they didn't, and there were 6 living people who knew that, and all 6 were inside this compound, she said nothing yet. She ran it back. The way they'd timed the courtyard to the single gap in the rotation, the way every move the father made seemed to reach them before he'd finished making it. The demand that named a grave only a handful of men had ever known existed. And the steady old voice all night urging him to act, to send men, to put bodies in the street. She did not let her face change. But she understood, with a cold that started in her stomach, that the grieving man on the phone and someone warm and trusted inside these walls were closer than anyone here wanted to believe. She had no idea, sitting in that basement, that saying it out loud would cost her everything she'd built in one night and very nearly cost Baum her life. She'd find that out soon enough. The proof of life went wrong in the rain. They'd agreed to a low handoff under the bridge, a glimpse of the girl alive before anything else moved, and Imara insisted on making it herself because she no longer trusted the read of anyone in that building, and because a frightened young man is easier to manage face-to-face than down a line. So she stood under the bridge in a downpour with the Black River roaring beside her, and a kid barely out of his teens, the younger voice from the calls. The one who had flinched when the older man snapped at him, shaking behind a concrete pillar, a gun in a hand that did not want to hold it. And she did the thing she was built to do. She talked. Not about the grave, not about the debt. About him. About how scared he was. About how the men who'd hired him would let him hang for this without blinking. About how she was, at this exact moment, the only person alive who was interested in him walking away from it. She kept her voice low and warm, and even while everything in her screamed, and she watched his shoulders come down a single inch, and in that inch he held up a phone, and there she was. Baum. Frightened, pale, clutching the rabbit. She was not brave about it, and she was not clever about it. She was a worn-out, scared 6-year-old. And what she did was complain, the way exhausted children do, in a small, cracked voice meant for nobody. I can't sleep, she said, not to the camera, barely to anyone at all. There's a sad boat outside, and it keeps doing the same loud thing, and it won't stop, and I hate it. And then, because she was the kind of child who put a tune to everything she couldn't fix, she hummed it back under her breath. 3 falling notes, the shape of a sound she'd been hearing for hours, and a hand reached in and hushed her, and the video ended. It was Imara who went cold. It was Imara who heard, underneath a tired child's grievance, a horn looping out over water nobody crossed anymore, the dead dock below the bend in the river. Mappo. Of course it was Mappo. He had hidden the girl at the very place it all began, so the geometry would be perfect when he closed it. Then headlights swept the bridge, too early, and the father's men came in hot, because someone had told them to be ready, and someone had given the word, and the boy bolted in terror, and the whole fragile thing nearly came apart with a child's life inside it. Imara went flat behind the pillar, kept her head, kept the line, and saved the night by a thread. She walked back into that war room soaked and cold and furious in a way the weather had nothing to do with, because someone had moved those men against her order, and there were only so many hands that could have. Yule found her shaking. He didn't ask the question a boss asks. He crossed the room and put his own coat around her soaked shoulders before he said a single word, and only then, quietly, "Are you hurt?" "No." A beat, her jaw tight. "Someone sent your men in. Someone in this house who has wanted you to charge all night." The ghost of something crossed his face. "It wasn't me," he said, and the terrible part was that she believed him, which meant it was someone he'd never suspect. Quick pause if you're as gripped as I hope you are. Take 1 second to subscribe so this channel doesn't get lost in your feed, and drop a comment with your guess. Who inside that house is the traitor? Then stay with me, because the truth is stranger and far sadder than anyone in that room is ready for. She named the old man that night, and it broke them. She laid it out the way she laid out everything, cold and clean. The 6 who knew the safe sites, the leaks, the schedule timed to the gap. The men moved against her word by a voice the father would never question. The demand that named a grave only the men who dug it could know. Every thread running back to one steady, sorrowful hand. "It's Mock," she said. "The man who raised you. He's been at your shoulder all night, steering you straight into it." Yule went perfectly still, and then he did the thing she had warned him men in his state always do. He reached for the bearable lie over the unbearable truth. "No," he said. "Not him. You heard me say it yourself. He doesn't even know there was a death. He thinks the boy ran off with money. There is nothing in the world for him to avenge. You have been under my roof a handful of hours. He has been in my life since before I had one worth taking." "He knows," Imara said. "He found out, and he has known long enough to keep pouring your coffee while he knew it. The lie you've been so certain held for 25 years did not hold, and the only man in this country who couldn't see that is the one who needed it not to be true. I'm telling you where the evidence points. The reason you can't follow it is that following it costs you the one person you swore you would never have to doubt, and right now you would rather your daughter carry that cost than carry it yourself." His voice went to stone, because she'd said aloud the thing he'd spent the night not saying. "You're wrong. Look again." "I have looked. You go find someone who'll tell you it isn't him. They're cheap, and they're everywhere. That's the whole problem with being you." And she picked up her bag, his coat still warm on her shoulders, and walked out of the compound into a gray, ordinary dawn. Because she had buried one child standing in a room with a powerful man who decided he knew better, and she had sworn on that small grave she would never do it again. Pyo-gyom found her 20 minutes later at a bus stop, of all places, sitting in the cold with her bag on her lap and nowhere on earth to be. He sat down without asking and put a folder in her hands. 15 years I've kept that man alive, he said, watching the empty street. I've watched 100 people try to get close to him for what he has. You're the first I've watched try to get close to his daughter instead. He nodded at the folder. The first pages were the proof. Transfers the old man had routed through a shell he thought no one would ever find. Calls placed from his private line in the minutes before each leak. Mock. It was Mock. The walkout had been right, and seeing it in ink made it real. And then, sitting in the cold with the rain starting again, Imara heard the father's voice in her head, the hitch in it, "I made him," and the choice of the gentler word, and the gentle word every single time after. And she understood what her own ear had been trying to tell her since the table. "He never said killed," she said out loud, very softly. "Not once. He said disappear, every time, and flinched the one time he reached for anything stronger." She looked at Pio. He didn't do it. He was 23 and terrified, and he was ordered to put a man in the river, and he couldn't, so he faked it. The brother at Mappo never died. Pio started to say that was impossible, and then she turned to the last page of his own folder, and there it was, the thing she'd glimpsed on a screen at 3 in the morning and assumed was a bribe. A sealed account buried in the oldest layer of the books, 25 years of small, careful payments every month to a name no one in the organization had ever heard, in a quiet town up the coast where a man with a new name and a careful silence could stay buried in plain sight. "There," she said, and her voice had gone gentle, almost wondering, because the worst man she'd met all night had just turned out to have spent half his life quietly committing the same act of mercy over and over in the dark. That's not a debt, and it's not a bribe. That's a man paying to keep a dead man alive. The brother on the boat has been breathing this whole time, and your boss has been lying about it every morning for 25 years. To the one person who'd kill him for the truth, and the one person who'd weep at it. And they're the same man. Pyogyeom looked at her, and a stillness he'd worn for 15 years cracked clean down the middle. He didn't make a speech. He took out his phone and started a call and said only, "I need a man who isn't supposed to exist brought in before this morning is over. Send the helicopter." Then, to her, "Get back in the car." Imara was already standing. "We're not going to pay this man off, and we're not going to put him down," she said. "He has built 25 years around a brother in the ground. We're going to give him the brother back. Bring the man home." When she walked back into that war room, Yul stood so fast his chair went over, and for a moment neither of them said a word, and the space they hadn't closed across a table hours ago was the only thing in the room. Then he did the only thing he had left, which was the truth. "I was 23, he said, the stone gone out of his voice entirely. "I took him to the water and I could not do it. I put him on a boat and I told the chairman it was finished. And I have spent every year since keeping a dead man alive in the dark and lying to his brother's face across a table and telling myself the silence was the mercy when the truth was the mercy the whole time." He looked at her, wrecked. "I didn't know how to hand Mock the truth without handing him my own throat." "You don't hand it to him as a confession," Imara said. "You hand it to him as his brother." She crossed the room and took his wrist, 2 fingers on the pulse, the way she had at the very start. Except this time, it wasn't to stop him. It was to bring him back to himself. "The chief is bringing the man at Mappo home. When this is done, you're going to stand in front of the old man and give him back the family the chairman took, alive, who never abandoned him, who never knew you'd told him otherwise. But that's second. First, there is a living child at the end of a dock, and we have 2 hours. Can you give them to me?" His pulse steadied under her fingers, and he turned his hand over, just slightly, so that for a breath it wasn't her holding his wrist, but the 2 of them holding on. "Tell me what to do," he said. So she told him, and the play was a thing of cold, exact, unhurried craft. And the kindness in it was that it ended in a reunion instead of a grave. They fed the old man a lie through the one channel he thought was his alone. A change of place, a change of time, a promise that the father would come to the Mappo dock alone and undefended to kneel and answer for the water, the moment Mock had been building toward for half his life. And the old man, who had been so patient, so certain the symmetry was his to close, moved exactly the way a grieving man moves when he is finally offered the thing he has ached for. He pulled the crew to the dead dock Imara had drawn out of a train, and a loudspeaker, and a tired girl humming a horn, on a clock she had written for them, into a place the father's people had quietly owned for an hour before anyone arrived. There was no gun battle, because she didn't run those. Gun battles get children killed. There was, instead, a side room, and a frightened teenager who had let his shoulders drop 1 inch under a bridge in the rain hours before. Imara had given him a number and a promise that night, and meant both. And now the trap was closing, and the boy had a choice no plan could make for him. He'd been told, if it ever came to this, to put the girl in front of him and use her. But the girl, it turned out, had spent the whole long night refusing to be afraid of him, asking his name, telling him the rabbit was named Tofu, she had named the cat Bomb and the goldfish Bomb, and very nearly everything she loved Bomb. But the rabbit, for reasons known only to her, was Tofu, and she would not be argued out of it. deciding out loud that he was one of the good ones because he'd given her his jacket when the concrete got cold and because he'd let her keep the light on. A 6-year-old had been working on him the entire time, in the only currency she had, which was the simple, terrible faith that he was a person worth being good for, and between her and the woman who'd promised him a door, the boy made his choice on his own 2 feet. He opened the side door and he walked Bomb out into the gray morning himself, tofu in one of her hands and his sleeve in the other, and he handed her up into her father's arms and then put his own hands up and waited. Because Imara had promised him that if he chose right, she'd be standing there when it ended, and she was. And then came the thing the old man had not planned for in 25 years of planning. Yule did not kneel, and he did not beg. He faced the old man across the wet boards, the man who had fed him as a boy, taught him to knot a tie, raised him up out of nothing, and for once he let Mock say the thing to his face. "You took the only family I had down to that water," Mock said, and his voice did not rise, and that was the worst of it. "And you handed me a story about a boy who ran off, and let me grieve a coward for half my life, and then I learned the truth of it, and went on pouring your coffee every morning with the same hands, and waited. I never wanted your money, Yule. I wanted you to stand where I have stood. I wanted you to lose the thing you love and never once be told the truth of how." Yule did not defend himself, because there was no defending it. He only said, "You're right, about all of it but one." And he stepped aside, and the chief walked a man up the dock, out of the dark, gray now, older, a quarter-century of exile in his face, the brother on the boat, the man at Mapo, alive. For a moment, Mok Sung-cheol simply could not understand what he was seeing. And then the man from the boat said one thing, the only thing. He said his brother's old name, the family name for him, the one only a brother would know. And Mok Sung-cheol made a sound that no one on that dock would ever forget. And the whole vast architecture of his vengeance came down all at once and without resistance, the way a wave that has traveled 1,000 miles simply lies down flat at the end of itself. There is nothing left to avenge in a brother who is breathing. He was not killed. The father was far too careful for that. He was finished, stripped of everything he held, made into a warning that would never need repeating. But he walked off that dock with his hands buried in his brother's coat, weeping in a way his body did not seem to know how to do. 25 years coming out of him in the rain, and that was a heavier sentence and a greater mercy than any bullet. Off to the side, in the thin gray light, Imara Diallo watched a father fold himself around a small living body, watched Bomb's fist close around the back of his collar, the exact way it had closed around Tofu's ear in a photograph a lifetime ago, and felt something move in her chest that hadn't moved in 3 years. She did not lose this one. She took Khalil out of her wallet and looked at him a long time, and the looking did not feel like going under. It felt like a debt, finally, partly paid. She was meant to leave that same morning. There was a flight, a job, a small, quiet life as far from her own name as a person could get. She stood in the great entrance hall with her bag at her feet, the way she'd stood at her own door only hours before saying no, and found, to her irritation, that she did not want to pick it up. The house felt different now, not in any way you could point to, but the held-breath quality that had filled every room of it had loosened into something that actually breathed. Yule came down the stairs with his daughter asleep on his shoulder and stopped when he saw the bag. "You're leaving. You don't need me anymore." "She's home." "That isn't the same thing, and you know it isn't, because you're the one who taught me to hear the difference." He came the rest of the way down, careful of the sleeping child, and stood closer than the conversation strictly needed him to. "My whole life I've been the one who decides for everyone. Tonight a stranger walked into my house and decided for me, and was right about all of it, including the thing I would rather have drowned than believe. I don't know how to ask a person to stay. People stay for what I have." A pause. "You don't want anything I have." "No." "Then I have nothing to offer you," he said. "But this, the only hours I have felt like a man and not a name in 25 years, were the ones in that basement, with you telling me I was wrong. I'm not asking you to stay for the house, or the work, or any of it. I'm asking because the thought of you on that flight is the only part of tonight I can't make myself be calm about. It was a graceless thing to say, and entirely true. And she felt the last wall she'd held up for 3 years come down. She reached out, the old reflex, 2 fingers toward his wrist, to ground him the way she had at the start, and the worst of it. And he caught her hand before it landed, and turned it, and pressed his own 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist instead, to the pulse going hard there, the mirror of everything she'd done for him all night. "Breathe," he said, very low. "You've held everyone steady all night. Let it be your turn." And he didn't let go of her wrist, and she didn't take it back. And the small distance they'd left open hours ago, across a table in the dark, narrowed to almost nothing, close enough now that she could feel the warmth coming off the sleeping child between them. Close enough that neither of them had anywhere left to look but at each other. And for a long moment, that was all there was. Neither of them moved. Neither of them closed it. Then Imara stepped back, gently a hand resting once against his arm, so he'd know it wasn't a retreat. "It's been one night," she said, not like a rule, more like something she was working out as she said it. "The longest one I've had in 3 years. And I don't think either of us should trust what a night like this makes a person feel, not yet. Not while we're both still standing in the middle of it." She almost smiled. "I'm not going anywhere this morning. That's the most I'm sure of. Let the rest of it happen in daylight." And Yule, who had not been told no by anyone in 20 years, and had been told no twice in one night by the same woman, both times when she was right, found that what rose in him wasn't disappointment. It was something closer to relief, that whatever this turned out to be, it would not be decided by the worst night of their lives. He let his hand fall from her wrist. "In daylight, then," he said, and she left the bag where it was. Morning came in gently, the way it does after the one night that changes everything. The long table in the dining room, which the staff had only ever set for a grieving man and a quiet girl who pushed her food around, was set that morning for 3, and a 6-year-old in pajamas was delivering the complete and serious history of a rabbit named Tofu while a sleepy woman listened to every word like it was the most important briefing in the house. The chief came in with the morning report, precise, thorough, nothing wasted, delivered it, turned to go, and stopped. "Miss Diallo." She looked up. He chose his words the way he'd chosen them carefully for 15 years. "The phone you hung up, the bridge." The word you caught that he'd said 4 times and I'd missed for 15 years. A pause. "I've spent my life keeping this family safe by watching the doors. You're the first person I ever met who keeps people safe by listening to them. We could have used you a long time ago." He held her eyes 1 beat longer than a security chief ever holds anyone's, and then he left, because he was Pyogyom and he had a job to do. Imara looked at the father, who was watching his daughter with an expression he was no longer bothering to hide. "He never says anything like that," she said. "To anyone." Yule agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way it almost never did. "Frame it." And then Baum, who had decided sometime in the last hour that the sleepy woman across the table belonged to them now, slid out of her chair and climbed straight into Imara's lap with the rabbit, and announced to the room with total 6-year-old authority that Tofu had decided Imara was allowed to stay, and that Tofu was never wrong about things. And Imara, who had read 100 dangerous men in 100 terrible rooms and had not let one of them past her in 3 years, was undone completely by one small girl and a stuffed rabbit, and she laughed, full and warm and entirely unguarded, the kind of laugh that finds every cold corner of a house that has run too long on fear and fills them all at once. Yule watched the 2 of them, his daughter and the woman who'd walked through his worst night, tangled up together over a rabbit's official ruling, and something in his face simply let go of the last of its 25 years. The girl laughed because Imara was laughing, and for a moment the room was loud, with a sound it had not made in a very long time. Across the table, In the first gold light coming through the windows, Yule caught her eye. He didn't reach for anything clever. He didn't have the armor for it anymore. He only glanced toward the window at the sun, well and truly up now, the daylight she'd told him to wait for, and then back at her. And Imara held his eyes and let herself smile, the child warm in her lap, every wall she'd carried for 3 years lying wherever it had fallen in the night. She didn't reach for the bag. She didn't reach for the door. The daylight had come. She had her answer. So, by the look on her face, did he. Imara Diallo had come to Seoul to get as far from her own name as a person could get, carrying a boy in her wallet and a wound that wouldn't close. She had answered a door at 2 in the morning and said no, and then a sleeping girl named Bomb had undone every wall she'd built, and she had walked into the worst hours of a stranger's life and done the one thing she'd sworn never to do again. She had listened. She had listened to a kidnapper's breathing, and to a brave child humming a horn, and to a powerful man flinch on a single word, and that listening had dragged the whole buried truth up out of the dark and handed a grieving brother back his family and given a small drowned boy, at last, somewhere in her own chest, a place to rest. Funny, the doors that open when you pick up a phone you'd promised yourself you'd never touch again? She had picked it up. Outside, Seoul moved through its morning, vast and indifferent and magnificent, carrying its 10 million stories without pausing to explain a single one. But this one, the city had quietly witnessed a woman who could read a soul through a phone line, a man who finally let himself be read, and a little girl who had simply decided the woman was staying from the first moment a finger pressed a red icon and a room full of armed men forgot to breathe. The end. If you made it here, thank you, genuinely. You are exactly who this channel exists for. If this story made you feel something, if there was a moment that made smile at your screen or feel something you weren't expecting, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it means everything to this channel. Subscribe if you haven't, because we've got more stories coming that are going to hit even harder than this one. And drop a comment below. Tell me your favorite moment. The hang-up? The word she caught that he kept flinching away from? The girl humming the horn? The brother on the dock? Tofu's ruling at the end? I read every single comment. Every one. I'll see you in the next story.